Scientists are leaving their labs and going out into the streets.
The March for Science is this Saturday, but many are asking if scientists can also be activists. I'm Dan Ming.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Hey, Bill Nye the Science Guy here. Not only am I moving around the world, I am flowing with the stream.
Here are just some of the hashtags being used to talk about the March for Science. Well, several people are using them to share their concerns about the march. Some say they worry the rally will politicize science and make it a partisan issue. Others are pointing out U.S. President Trump's stance towards the science community, here addressing Trump's proposed cuts to federal agencies and appointment of climate change skeptics in his administration. Many think it's time for scientists to get off the sidelines. Lon Koenig writes, science doesn't have a political party, while Jenny Liu tweets, speak up, speak now.
And it seems like many are. The march has gathered momentum globally. The main event is in Washington, D.C., but as you can see here, there are over 500 sister marches planned around the world. Organizers say the march is not political, but as you heard, there's a lot of disagreement over that. It has raised questions about the role of scientists in politics. Here to talk to us about the intersection of science and activism, in Boston, Lydia villa-Komaroff is a molecular biologist and an honorary chair of the March for Science. Ray Wynn Grant is a conservation scientist at the Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Alex Barizo is a senior fellow in biomedical science at the American Council on Science and Health. And Richard Alley is a geoscientist at Pennsylvania State University. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. Lydia, I want to start with you. Why was it important for you to be part of this march?
I joined the march for several reasons, primary of which is that I believe that we've lost sight as a society of how important science is in just about everything that we do. Clothes we wear, televisions we watch, phones we use, cars, everything. And we've lost sight of the importance of facts. And so I think that it's time for science to stand up and speak for the importance of those things as we move forward in governing our society.
So you lay out your case pretty convincingly there. Alex, I pulled up on my screen here a blog post you wrote a little while ago. This is in February. It spread pretty wide. The headline says it all, why this scientist won't be attending the quote-unquote science march. Alex, what was it that made you say no?
Well, it was what I perceive to be a pretty political nature of the march. It started off as an anti-Trump movement, at least that was my first initial impression. And kind of became covered by a veneer of science. But if you listen to the Twitter feed, there's a lot of not scientific stuff coming out of their Twitter feed. It's a lot of political stuff, talking about marginalized people and increasing diversity. And those are all perfectly fine ideas. I'm just curious, what are the positions on nuclear power? What are the positions on genetically modified food? What's the position on vaccines? I was wanting to see a policy stance, and I didn't see any policies. And so because of that, I'm very skeptical of it.
So speaking of the political stuff, I have a few headlines here, and Richard, I want to bring you into the conversation. You can see on my computer, so a headline from December, Trump taps climate change denier to head the EPA. So that's about Scott Pruitt, of course, who's heading the Environmental Protection Agency. We have Trump's budget proposal, which Nature magazine called bad for science agencies, and then we have Washington Post saying that science are conspicuously missing from Trump's budget. So Richard, do you think that there's something particularly concerning for scientists when it comes to this new administration?
I do think there are real concerns coming up now. So CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It makes it warmer. This changes the climate. This will affect us. That is as close to fact as anything we're likely to get. What you should do about that is not for me to say. But somebody comes in and says, we don't know that CO2 is warming the climate. That worries me. And so I have heard statements coming from Washington recently that I don't think are fully consistent with things we know, and that really does worry me. Personally, I would love to see more funding for our research, but that's self-serving. Somebody else has to decide that.
Well, I'm sure many scientists, though, would agree with you there. So it's more than just self-serving. There's a whole community behind you. I do want to bring up this. This is the official web page for the March for Science, which happens on Earth Day, April 22nd, this Saturday. And organizers behind this rally do say that it's not about politics per se. It's a celebration of science. Ray, you were on the fence about whether or not you were going to participate. What did you decide?
So I am another one of those scientists who has decided not to join the march this weekend, not because I don't support the march. I completely do, and I encourage everybody, as many people as possible, to get out there and march for science and for facts and evidence-based science to be a part of our government now with this administration and for future administrations. I have chosen not to march for a variety of reasons. The number one being that I have some really important family matters going on this weekend that trump, for lack of a better word, the importance of the march for me personally. But also, I have been feeling a little bit conflicted. I practice advocacy in ways other than being out in the streets and marching, and I've yet to join marches for women's rights. I've yet to join marches for Black lives. And I felt really uncomfortable with having my first march be for one that impacts mostly my career choice and those of my colleagues, as opposed to something much more personal. And so I am giving my full support to this.
Alex?
Yeah, I completely agree with Ray. The idea, maybe this is just a scientist in me, because we're all PhDs up here, but I think that the idea of writing something on a sign and going out and yelling at cars as they drive by is not a good way to get my message out.
But you can't get your message out if nobody pays attention. And we haven't been very good as scientists about making the point about why what we do is important. I think I agree with most of you that we aren't necessarily the ones to make the final decisions about things. But if we're not at the table, if facts are not part of the discussion, then I don't think we'll make the best choices. And I think it's also important that the idea behind the march continue beyond the march. It's not enough to just march. That's just a way of getting attention and of saying, here we are, a very, very large group of people who vary in their beliefs, in the things that they care about. But we do believe that science has to be part of the discussion, and that the draconian measures that are being in place in this administration, support for science has been diminishing much longer than this administration has been in office. It's been going on for a couple of decades now. I think this administration is the catalyst for the march, but not really the base reason for it.
So Lydia,
I would like to respond to something that Alex just said. I agree with many of your reasons not to march, but I do think it's important to acknowledge the effectiveness that marching has had historically in this country. Real change has been made historically from people getting on the streets, holding up those signs, honking their horns in their cars, and we should not ever diminish that. But it might not be one's personal way that they do their science advocacy in that form.
So Ray, do you think that this march would not lead to real concrete change then?
I think it's fantastic for awareness building, as we just heard. It's a really great idea to get people in the streets, to get that visibility and the media attention. I think very often scientists don't engage the media well enough, and a march might be a great way to begin a new phase of engaging science in the media, which would then give us a platform to do much more work post-march, as we just heard.
So
I unfortunately don't think it's...
Go ahead, finish your thought.
Go ahead. Okay, I unfortunately don't think that the march is going to have much of an impact, and the reason is because of the mixed messages that have been sent. You said that, you were reading from the March for Science website, and it said that, well, we're not political. But their Twitter feed says the exact opposite. On March 9th, there was a tweet that says, here's what the Science March is. We are political. We value diversity. We won't put up with harassment. And so those are perfectly fine, but there's mixed messages coming out. Some organizers say it's not political. Others say that it is. And the overwhelming impression I have of people that have been following this is that it's a very political march.
So Alex, I want to ask you about when you think it is appropriate for scientists to get political. So look at this tweet here on my computer. It's somebody's making a sign for the march. You can see here, it says, climate change isn't left or right, it's science. But Alex, maybe the facts of climate change aren't necessarily left or right, but how we respond to it is a political question, right?
Correct. And I think that the line that I try to draw is that I never want to endorse or criticize political parties. I think that scientists are getting into really big trouble when they do that. Imagine if the military said, thank goodness that, this particular political party's gone because they were terrible for defense. They would never say something like that. And I think scientists get in trouble when they openly endorse one political party over another. And so I think
there's a bit of a
So Alex, I want to jump in here because Alex, you made an interesting point about, I will go to you actually with this. Alex made an interesting point about political parties and whether or not scientists should align themselves with them. We have heard the criticism of the Trump administration, but I want us to take a look here at my laptop. This is EPA.gov. Everyone knows and can go to it. It's very easy to get to, but what everyone may not be aware of is that several scientific bodies that the U.S. has, including one of them, the Environmental Protection Agency, was created under a Republican administration, maybe proving that point that this isn't about political parties. This is about more than that. This is the official formation of the EPA on their timeline, December 2nd, 1970. So, Lydia, I know you wanted to jump in here. This is about more than just politics.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of a confusion between the political and the partisan. I think that as citizens, it's incumbent upon us to make our opinions known. And the scientific community has a variety of opinions about the facts that we have found. So I agree that we should not, as a group, endorse or criticize particular parties. Science in general has had friends and foes on both sides of the aisle. This isn't about one party or the other. It really is about science needs to be at the table, and scientists need to support in the general public the importance of science. If we don't make the case, who will?
So, Richard, I want to bring you.
I'd love to add to what Lydia is saying.
Go ahead,
and also explain that although people have disagreements on whether science is political or science is not political, and we could debate that all day, it's important to acknowledge that scientists can be political people and political bodies. And often when your identity is political, whether you are a person of color or an immigrant, someone from a marginalized group, when your identity becomes political, your ability to be a scientist and to practice science in the workplace or to even engage in a pathway to becoming a scientist also becomes political. And in that way, our political system, whatever administration it may be, can impact who is a scientist in our country, in the world, and how science is then done for this country or for the world. So there really is this intersectionality that's really important to acknowledge.
Yes.
I'd like to bring Richard back into the conversation here too. So we got this video comment from Kevin in Florida, and he's not attending the march. He's a scientist as well, but he had a comment on the public's perception of scientists and whether or not there's a trust issue. Take a listen.
While it's great that people are standing up for science, is a march the best way to do it? The problem is that as scientists, we suffer from a lack of trust. So how do we get it? Do we go to the streets and say, what do we want? Trust. When do we want it? Now. No, the only way we're going to change this is by sharing our values, talking about what's important to us as scientists, why we do what we do, and then walk the walk, talk the talk, do acts of good, get out in the communities, get out in your schools, do this on a sustained and regular basis with full transparency. This is the way that will change it. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint.
So Richard, do you agree that science suffers from a lack of trust?
The surveys tend to show that in the United States, we respect the military more than anything else, and scientists often come in second. So the surveys are still that we have a lot of trust. We have less than we would like. I believe we have less than is deserved, but I hope I'm correct about that. So I think that we absolutely unequivocally have to keep the trust up. And so he's right on some points there, and it was fun to hear that.
So I like
But
that.
if you look,
I just want to take just a pause here, and I hear you, Alex, and I'll come back to you. But I like that Richard sort of read our minds here, and granted, Dan and I know that we are in the presence of brilliance. We have 4 PhDs on this show here today. So Richard, I have this webpage up on my screen. You just mentioned it, so I want to share it with the rest of our audience. Most Americans trust the military and scientists to act in the public's interest. So you're right. It's about 76% of people say they share or express at least a fair amount of confidence in scientists. But there's another study, this one, Zogby Analytics and Research America, that says Americans can't name a living scientist, most of them anyway. Alex, how do you bridge that gap?
well, I think that a lot of people like the idea of the romantic idea of science, but I don't think we do a particularly good job of science education in K through 12. And so I think if we did a more improvement there, we would have more knowledgeable people about science. But the public trust of science, while it is number 2 to the military, it has been falling among conservatives. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why are conservatives becoming less and less trustworthy of science? I don't think, as Lydia said, it's because it's a left or right issue, but I think it's because much of the public is starting to see science as too political. And so that's my concern. I guard science like I guard my own, reputation in my house. And so I don't want it to be seen as a political institution.
So I want to ask Lydia about the question of what comes after you march in the streets. We got this tweet here from Black Physicists, and he said, or she said, so I'll make it plain. If you hashtag Science March on Saturday, but don't visit your representatives and or senator's office on Friday, you're missing the point. So Lydia, how can the momentum of this movement, it's already gained a lot of attention, how can it be sustained through the rest of the political process?
I think we've already heard some of it. I think that we do have to continue to talk to the people that we're comfortable talking to. It would please me greatly if more scientists talk to their representatives about their work and about the importance of that work. Not necessarily about how that work should be used. That's a policy decision that in the end our legislators will decide, but to acquaint them with it and to make them aware of what we're doing is very important. And also, as Ray said, we need to talk out in the community more. Go to schools, talk to students, talk to your neighbors, talk to your family. Most of us come from families where, not everybody is a scientist. And so all of those conversations, I think, are important in informing people about who we are and what we do.
So I want everyone to take a look at my screen right here. This is the March for Science, and they're so pleased to have Dr. Lydia villa-Komaroff join as honorary chair, and that is because, Lydia, you have a 20-year research career. You've worked at MIT, Harvard University, Harvard Medical School, among other places, and you were the lead on a team that helped discover how bacterial cells could be used to create insulin. That's a big deal. So what are you doing, and how do you advise others to do the same thing in disseminating all that knowledge you have and what you know, and making sure that people know why it's important?
I spend a lot of time talking to students of all ages, K-12 on up through college and beyond. I also talk in the community a fair amount. I give community lectures. I think it was 2 weeks ago, I gave a lecture in San Marcos, California, where I talked about not just my science, but about my life and about, my family and where we all came from, and how I became a scientist and how much fun it is, because it really is about the best thing I can imagine doing. I also have been involved in several societies, AAAS, and which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Society for Cell Biology. Both have parts of themselves which are interested in policy and in outreach, and I've been involved in both of those. And I serve on national committees that are interested in issues that I'm interested in.
Ray, I know you wanted to get in there. So Ray wants to get in, and Alex wants to get in. Ray, I had to cut you off a little bit. So Ray, you go first.
Oh, I did want to jump in and say that I echo Lydia, it's important to do a lot of communication. I feel that scientists often fail to properly communicate science. I think also scientists often fail to communicate to people that they are indeed scientists. I think a lot of people, you showed the pie chart that showed that the majority of Americans can't name a living scientist. They obviously don't know that the dentists and the doctors that they see very often are
Very
scientists.
good point.
They don't know that the teachers teaching them science are scientists. It took me a while to learn that I need to refer to myself as a scientist in order for people to know that that's what I do. When I say that I'm a carnivore ecologist, that doesn't mean much to a lot of people, even my own family.
It doesn't mean that much to Dan and I either, I'm going to admit. What does that mean?
What does it mean?
I have a
Exactly
headline
what it
here
means.
that says, this is from 538, the blog, and it says, "The secret to tracking and mapping bears." That is what you do, but what does that mean?
Certainly. So I am a carnivore ecologist. Carnivores are animals, also in plants. So they're organisms that consume meat. In particular, I study lions and black bears in the United States. And being an ecologist means I study the interactions between organisms and their environment. So I don't just study the environment, I study how the organism and its environment interact and what does that mean for the life of the organism. So I spend a lot of time in the outdoors, and I do trap and tranquilize and map the distribution of how bears use their landscape. And that's something that I'm glad you asked me, because it's important for me. It's a really great exercise for me to communicate that better, especially in public.
So in terms of communicating all your work as scientists to the public and translating it into policy, Richard, I want to get you back in the conversation. So we got this video comment from Jules in New York. Take a listen.
So I'm very excited that we're leading a contingent of drug policy researchers in the Science March this Saturday. Drug policy is one of the many arenas where, unfortunately, policy is not always driven by science. Rather, when it comes to drugs, our policy is usually driven by fear and misinformation and stigma. And that's led to punitive policies that have resulted in the mass incarceration of millions of Americans, primarily people of color. So on Saturday, we'll be marching to call for evidence-based drug policies rooted in science about what we know is helpful to people who are struggling with addiction.
So Richard, that was an example about drug policy, but I wanted to hear from your experience in your field. If you feel that current policy is out of step with what the science shows, how do you convince policymakers to change?
I wish I knew. It is a very hard communications problem, because we are trying to create understanding. We are trying to build something, and there are people that are trying to break it. And it is much, much easier to break things than it is to build them. The basic science of climate, right? The first serious scientific calculation of how much warming we get from fossil fuel CO2 was made by Arrhenius, a Swedish physical chemist, in 1896. Right now, if you've seen the tweet about climate change being invented by the Chinese to destroy the American economy, if they planted Arrhenius in Sweden in 1896, my hat is off. Really, the physics is fantastically good. The modern quantum mechanical understanding of global warming rests on work that was done by the Air Force after World War II for sensors on heat-seeking missiles. And there's really no question about this. It does not tell you whether you have to tax gas or not. But we're spending a lot of time arguing about things that we actually know better than anything else in the discussion. And that's hard.
I actually think that there's a way that we can influence policy, and that is to become writers. Now, of course, I've been a writer for the past 7 years, so maybe I'm very biased. But I found that the way to influence policy would be to publish in USA Today and Wall Street Journal, New York Times. It's not always easy to do, but those are influential and widely read papers. The organization I work for, the American Council on Science and Health, this is what we do. We're science advocates. And so I would encourage scientists to contact us and say, hey, you know, I've got an issue and I would like to write about it. When you start practicing communicating with the public, you become better and better and better at it.
I like that.
We could probably chime in on that, right? So I
I'm going
think
to
you're
I'm going to let you chime in on that in our post show. We have a whole space for it online, stream.aljazeera.com, because for right now, that's all the time we have for this main part of the show. We're taking all of our guests, though, to that post show. Lydia, Ray, Alex, and Richard, all PhDs. Dan and I are going to join and learn a little bit more from them. If you take a look at my screen here, the March for Science, whether you're going or you're not going, April 22nd, 2017, we want to know. We want to hear from you. You can tweet us your take with hashtag AJStream, and Dan and I will be sorting through them, bring them up into the show. We'll see you online. Welcome back, everyone. We're talking about crossing the line from science into activism, when that's appropriate, and if there is a line at all. Richard, I had to pause you, but as you remember your points, you can bring it up again. I want to show our audience this. This is April 19, 2017. In new paper, scientists explain climate change using before and after photographic evidence. And so you're one of the leads on this paper. I want to share this beautiful photo with the rest of our audience. What are we looking at here, Richard?
Right, so on the top, you're looking at a glacier as it was, and on the bottom, you're looking at a glacier as it is. And virtually every glacier on the planet is shrinking, and some of them very spectacularly. And this is because it's getting warmer. And this is an easy way for the public to see what we know from so many different data sets, that we really are warming the climate. You can't see, that shows that it's warming. It doesn't show we're doing it, but we are.
Right. What was your point, though, that you wanted to chime in? Alex was saying something, and you wanted to chime in, and I don't want you to forget that point.
Right. So I think that Alex was talking to a group of people. I mean, Lydia is a hero. Ray is a hero. You're talking to people who actually do a huge amount of outreach, and I hope the message will go to others. I don't think my book sold quite as well as yours, Alex, but we keep trying.
Well, you know, Richard,
Hey,
if you were on Twitter.
The real hero here is Lydia. If I understand correctly, Lydia, you were making insulin for people, I'm assuming for diabetics. You are the hero here. I'm just some schlub who, did some science and wrote a book,
So speaking of the real hero, Lydia, I have a question for you. I have a couple of tweets I want to read. Daniel tweeted in, he said, in science, political has negative connotations because it's associated with bias. This definition is very narrow. And then he says, all our activities as scientists are political. Showing up to a march is political, but so is not showing up. So Lydia, do you think for all those who are deciding not to attend, that itself is a political statement?
Oh, sure. Doing is a decision, as is not doing. And so we make decisions consistent with what we're most comfortable with and what we believe. And that's entirely consistent. We all are, after all, people. And so we're going to differ in what we feel is appropriate to do and how we should act in any given situation. And that's the richness of the community, I think. And part of the message for people is that we're just people too. We've stayed in school a little bit longer than most people, but that's about the major difference.
Thank you for making Dan and I feel good about that.
I would like to
Ray,
chime
go
in
ahead.
and say, let us not forget that there are a lot of people unable to march this weekend,
Right.
not because they don't want to be there, but because they can't. There are a lot of scientists even who may be early career, stuck at work. It's inappropriate for them to leave. Students, in fact, who have to choose, doing well in school over spending time outdoors on Saturday. There are so many people who might not be in such privileged positions that they can spend their day in the streets marching. And that doesn't mean that they're not scientists themselves or that they aren't in complete support of the goals of the march. So there are different ways people can be advocates, and sometimes just living in your own body as your own individual is an act of resistance in itself. And so it's important to acknowledge all of those folks.
Alex, you had something to say?
And Lydia's absolutely right about making science personal. That the science isn't done by this behemoth, this leviathan of unfeeling automatons, right? It's done by people, And the caller that you had call in, Kevin Folta, he's been on the receiving end of some very harsh things being said about him because he had some money from Monsanto, which paid for a trip or something like that he went on. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something really minor, and people demonized him over it. And he's a very good and honest man. And if we have to make sure that people understand there are human beings behind that microscope, and they have good intentions.
And what we do as scientists is, in some sense, what humans have always done. We're curious, we want to know, we want to learn. The scientific method is we have agreed to play by a set of rules that make it really hard to fool ourselves. And otherwise, we're just people doing what people have always done.
And
Hear, hear.
We appreciate it. That is a perfect way to end this conversation. Hear, hear, indeed. Thank you so much to all of our guests for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to Lydia, Ray, Alex, and Richard, doctors, all of them. Dan, do you want to give us the final word from our community?
I'll give the last word to somebody who's clearly in support of the march. You can read here on my computer. Shira says, anyone, period, should be able to be what they are, a scientist in this case, and still have room for feelings or activism about what's going on. All are affected.
Well said. This conversation will continue online with hashtag AJStream. We'll see you there.